I'm John Travis in a hotel in Sydney where I'm doing a 2-week quarantine having returned from the States. It is the 22nd of November, 2020, and I'm talking to David Bresler in, are you still in Malibu or where is your
No, I'm in
apartment?
Los Angeles now.
In Los Angeles. Yeah, your home was Malibu and we'll get to it burning a few years ago. And it is only the 21st of November there. So I want to find out who you are and why. And the why is the most important part of the work that you're well known for, but the backstory of what led you to do this work, where you were born, what your parents did, how you were grown, raised, what siblings you had. Let's start with where and when and take it from there.
I was born in Washington, D.C. in March of 1943. That means me 77 years old at this point. And my mother was a educational psychologist for the D.C. public school system. My father was a real estate entrepreneur. Um, he had been trained as an accountant, but ended up just investing in various rental properties that he managed and so on. And it was a pretty delightful childhood. I have an older brother, 6 years older than me, who had photographic memory. And I had to follow him through the school system, and everybody knew of my brother because his memory was so extraordinary. And I just never felt that I was very smart, okay? I just felt I was more the athletic type. He was the brains, and I was a football player. I played football in high school and college and did all the sports and so forth. And I just gave all the academic stuff to my brother, okay? And when I graduated from high school, I got into some interesting colleges, but the one that sort of interested me the most was Brandeis, which is where I ended up. I went to college at Brandeis, and there was one of the professors there that, in doing correspondence with various people, I wanted to talk to professors who were doing the research that I wanted to get involved in college. And this professor was kind enough to correspond with me, but I think he also got me in. So I went to Brandeis, and in my freshman year, I met Abe Maslow, who was a professor at Brandeis at that time. I was
Wow.
I I always thought I would be a physician. I was pre-med. I had a joint major in biology and philosophy. I guess you could see my early interest in the mind-body connection
Uh-huh.
because not too many people had dual majors in college at that time, but I did, and I did a, you know, I would say that Abe and I became very close friends. I was president of my class all 4 years in college, and so there was a lot of politics going on during the 60s
Four
and so forth.
years. Wow. Is
Yeah,
that a record?
I have no idea. Okay, I was just popular with a lot of the kids there and politically very, very active. I grew up with a very sort of left-wing radical family, and we were always involved in politics. And I met John Kennedy. I actually worked for Jack Kennedy's election. I was in D.C. I was a high school student at the time, but we all went out
Oh,
canvassing, and he actually was congratulated us and thanked us, and it was pretty cool. Anyway, Abe Maslow pulled me out of medicine and told me, that's really a trade like a carpenter or a plumber. Doctors are. We need somebody to figure out how the brain works, how the mind works. You need to go into psychology. I had
so right,
no
so
prior.
right he was. I can tell you, but we were told in med school, this is basically a glorified meat cutting school.
Yeah.
A professor actually said that my second year.
So I ended up first, after I left Brandeis, I developed a very strong interest in learning and the biology of learning and the physiology of learning, how learning and memory works. And one of the great experts in that was Professor M.E. Bitterman, who was at Bryn Mawr College. So I wrote him, and we started a correspondence, and I told him some of my thoughts, and he liked my thoughts. He said, well, come to graduate school at Bryn Mawr. I said, it's an all-girls school. He said, not the graduate school, it's co-ed. You'd have fun here. I went, okay. So I was one
Oh,
of five
right.
single men and 850 single women. So it was busy. It was busy. I met my first wife there, and we eloped. We eloped, ran off, and got married. And that marriage lasted about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, and no kids or anything. But I did a lot of really, really interesting research with Bitterman, and kind of ended up doing my master's thesis there, which was kind of interesting. I had come across research of another professor at Bryn Mawr, Jane Oppenheimer, who had done something which I thought was very interesting. We had been taught in physiological psychology and other courses ways to interfere with normal brain function and figure out from the deficits that occurred what that part of the brain could do. I wasn't interested in doing any of that stuff. What I was interested in was, how do you make the brain smarter? How do you get it to function even better? What can be done to, like, increase the ability of it to function? And she had done some interesting experiments, okay? She had done it with a fish called the zebra brachydonio, zebrafish. What was interesting about these fishes, they were called African mouth breeders, meaning once the eggs were fertilized, the eggs were kept in the father's mouth. He didn't eat during that time. And the fetuses developed in the father's mouth. And when the babies hatched, okay, they would swim out of the father's mouth, and then the father would start to eat again. But what it meant was you could get hold of a fetus in early stages of development. And what she had done was, before the cells had differentiated, it was all non-differentiated cells in the embryo. She had taken cells from a donor embryo and implanted them into this undifferentiated organism. So when normal differentiation occurred, it not only developed tissue for itself, but for the additional cells that were put in. And she developed these fish that looked like they had much larger brains, for example, okay? So I went to her and learned her technique, and we developed a bunch of fish, okay? Because we mapped out the exact area on the embryo that would become the brain. In the fish, it's called the optic tectum. And we mapped out that area, and we planted those cells in. And sure enough, when we tested those fish that grew up as a result of this implanted surgery, they performed more like rats than fish on these learning tests that we had developed.
Wow.
And I published it. It turned out to be the lead article in Science magazine. They gave us the front page when we first published that study. But I thought it was really interesting research. And of course, we were looking at the possibility of maybe trying to do the same thing in upper species. But I started getting inquiries from a mysterious organization that was really interested in supporting this research, and me coming to a special research facility to do it. Well, remember, I was politically very active. I was arrested 10 times protesting the Vietnam War. If you ever see those pictures of the people sticking flowers in the muzzles of the soldiers at the Pentagon, 10,000 of us were arrested there. Can you imagine that? We were all fingerprinted and booked, and they put us behind, barbed wire, big gates and stuff. And don't get me started. Anyway, we did research on this organization, and it was quite clear that it was basically a CIA front, and I was not going to get involved with the mafia or the CIA or any other such organizations. So I decided it was time to change my research, and there were other things I was doing that was interesting too.
No more Frankenfish.
No
more Frankenfish.
I walked away from it. I literally did. It was just, I realized the implications of it, and it wasn't something, I was going to make super soldiers. Thank you. It was just not, that was not what I wanted my career to be. And I needed to have more research facilities available and more colleagues to work with. So I applied to transfer to UCLA, and I met I knew of a professor there who was doing research that I was interested in. I corresponded with him, and bingo, I got admitted to UCLA. It was the #1 psychology training program at the time. I didn't think I'd get in, but I did. And I was elected president of the graduate students. So I was very
presidential
active.
Material.
Yeah, I don't know. I was politically very active in those days. Okay, and but that was an amazing experience to really to do all the research that we did at UCLA, to have access to those facilities and other faculty members and so forth. And I basically, I did all my coursework in the first year that I was there just to get it out of the way. And I took double the number of units that you were supposed to. They didn't give me credit for my Bryn Mawr experience, which really pissed me off.
Oh,
And so they tell entering students to take 9 credits, okay, and maybe if, with permission, you'll take 12. Well, I wanted to take 24, and they told me no. So I appealed it, and I actually appealed it. I told them I was going all the way to the Regents on this because they're infringing on my academic freedom. And they allowed me to do it. And I said, if I don't ace these courses, you know, I'll drop back to what you want. But I've taken a lot of these courses. I know how to do this. Isn't a problem. So I got all my coursework done the first year. And it was a lot of work, but I got it done and did well. And it gave me my next 3 years to do all kinds of really just fantastically interesting research. My doctoral dissertation ended up using some pretty advanced techniques that I had learned. Basically looking at the relative roles of the indoalkylamines, serotonin, versus the catecholamines, norepinephrine and dopamine, and how they affected mood. And the way that I did this was, it was a 4x4 factorial experiment. So one group of rats were just perfectly normal. They had sham procedures done just to control for the trauma of the procedures. 1/4 of the rats had their catecholamine system disrupted by injecting directly into the brain another drug which just disabled that system. And the third group of rats, we disabled the serotonin system in another part, in the raphe nuclei of the brain, another part of the brain. And then in a fourth group of rats, we disabled both. So we could see none, one, the other, or both. And I published 7 papers out of that one dissertation and started publishing pretty rapidly early in my professional career. And
what's the Cliff Notes version of the results?
yeah, pretty much. But something very interesting happened. While I was at UCLA, I boxed for a couple of years, and then I saw some people doing some very strange kind of movements that I later found out was Tai Chi Chuan. And I ended up getting involved in it with 2 other students at UCLA. We got involved very early in Tai Chi, and we started doing it pretty aggressively, and ended up talking our Tai Chi master into teaching us Tai Chi sword, Tai Chi staff, Tai Chi, I mean, pretty advanced martial art techniques, because you think of Tai Chi as being very slow and very deliberate, but there's a very fast martial arts component of it. And I'd taken a lot of martial arts training, so I was real interested in it. So that was one thing that kind of got me interested in. And myself and 2 other graduate students would show up for our Tai Chi classes just sore as hell from the prior training, and it just really ached. And the Chinese kids weren't. And so one time we asked them, like, why are we like dragging our butts in here and you guys seem to be fine? They said, oh, well, we go to the acupuncturist after that. The what?
Oh.
The acupuncturist, what's that? Well, he sticks needles into us.
Oh boy.
And it gets rid of all the tension and all the fatigue, and you know, we feel great the next day. It's not a problem at all. So as it turned out, it was Chinese New Year, and we got invited to do a demonstration of advanced Tai Chi in the Chinese New Year in Chinatown in Los Angeles. Okay, the Chinese people used to call us lo fan. And it's a difficult word to translate. We used to say it lies somewhere between gringo and goyim. It's a little derogatory, but they'd never seen white guys, you know, basically doing pretty advanced, you know, Tai Chi movements and so on. And one of the people that we were introduced to was an acupuncturist, a master acupuncturist. We didn't know the guy was internationally famous at the time, but he invited us to come down and watch him. So I guess it was what, 1969, 68 or 69. It was pretty early in the game. We went down to Chinatown, and I'll never forget this day in my entire life. And the place was packed out with every ethnicity you could ever see. I mean, not just Chinese people, but every color skin you could imagine. We're standing in line waiting to come into this man's residence. And we were ushered in by our Tai Chi master, who's a close friend of this acupuncturist. And I got to examine a couple of the patients that were in the front of the line, and a lot of them had osteoarthritis and just very common things related to aging. The acupuncturist walks out, an elderly Chinese gentleman, and he kind of stumbles a little bit, and a couple of the needles fall out of the pan he's holding. He sets the pan down, he picks the needles up off the floor, wipes them off with his tie, and puts them back onto the. I later found out they don't believe in the germ theory. They think the germs are not the cause of disease, they're the result of disease. The cause of disease is energetic imbalances in these energy systems and so forth. Anyway, the first patient I ever saw was an old Jewish guy from the Fairfax district, okay, who had obvious osteoarthritis in his body, okay. I mean, I examined his hands, and they were all, red and inflamed joints, and had very limited range of motion. And I mean, you don't have to do scans or blood tests to make this diagnosis. It's fairly straightforward diagnosis. And the acupuncturist says, "Oh, osteoarthritis, easy to fix." And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, easy to fix. In those days, we'd say, get the biggest jar of aspirin you can find and eat them till your stomach bleeds, then back off. I mean, that's how we treated arthritis back then. We didn't have COX-2 inhibitors or, any of that stuff. Anyway, he sticks needles into this patient, and it made no sense to me, okay, in the ear, in the arms, in the leg. And about 10 minutes later, this man starts to cry. And he says, "Oh, it's a miracle. It's a miracle, my God. My hands." He pulls the needles out. And, and it's like that old Groucho Marx line. What are you going to believe, me or your lion eyes? I saw that with my lion eyes. Okay. And when I re-examined this guy, I'm telling you, the swelling of his joints had gone down and the inflammation had gone down. It just blew my mind. Okay. I mean, I could hardly sleep. We were just talking about it like crazy and talking to other patients who were standing in line. And I just realized I got to learn this stuff. I got to learn about acupuncture. Okay. And so I guess because of our Tai Chi master, okay, we became friends with this master acupuncturist. We paid him, I think it was $10 a session. But twice a week, we would go down to Chinatown. He wanted to be paid because he wasn't seeing patients, but he made us practice this, 1,000 times a day, and with this hand too. Why? Well, what if you hurt this hand? You're out of business. You got to have to do. And until you could take a 32 gauge needle, really tiny needle, okay, and insert it into the side of a roll of toilet paper without it bending at all, you weren't allowed to put needles into another human. Because you don't put it in with force, you put it in by moving your energy, your chi, down to the tip of the needle. And it's your energy that allows it just to slide in like. And I learned a technique for doing basically painless acupuncture. I never had patients complain about any pain when I put needles in them. I distract them a little bit and stretch the skin out a little bit, but I think it was also the technique that I learned really early in the game. So I was excited about it. And I graduated and got my PhD, and I was a professor in the psychiatry department at UCLA, but I was still studying acupuncture on the side. And I realized I've got to do some research on this. And I couldn't find anybody in the psychiatry department who I could interest in it. They thought it was all voodoo and placebo effect and so forth. Most of them didn't know anything about it, but even if I tried to educate them, of all the professors in the psychiatry, but I found one guy, okay, as I kept looking around in the anesthesia department, who was interested in pain. And he was interested in pain of women who were in labor. He was interested in chronic pain patients and so forth. Norm Levin was his name. And we partnered up. And so I started submitting petitions to the Human Subject Protection Committee, who kept turning them down. And so for 2 years, I kept sending more and more. With the 17th submission of my protocol to do acupuncture research to the Human Subject Protection Committee,
You
I
wore 'em
found
down.
that I went to the chairman of the department along the way, and he said, Dr. Bresler, don't you know, we're never going to approve this. We don't want this kind of research being done at UCLA. And I told him, I said, don't you understand? I'm never going to quit asking. But I found an unlikely ally, the chairman of the anesthesia department, who was one of the founders of the field. Because remember, anesthesia was only 40 years old at that time. Okay, it's the newest field, and it was one of the newest fields in medicine. And you remember, anesthesia opened up surgery, because prior to anesthesia, there was no major surgery. There was just amputations and circumcisions and childbirth. Okay, but he was a pioneer at developing anesthesia as a specialty in medicine. Okay, and he was retiring, but he had a strong dislike of the dean of the medical school, who was my main one protesting acupuncture. And so 2 things that interesting happened. Number one, he agreed to support me. And while I was at Brandeis, I had one interesting friend. Her name was Angela Davis.
Oh, really?
Yes. And
She's
Angela and
on
I
my
were
list to
friends.
interview.
And when Angela came to UCLA, we rekindled our friendship. And when she was sanctioned by the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, the Professors Union, I knew all about it. So with the help of the chairman of the anesthesia department, I threatened to bring a second AAUP lawsuit against UCLA. It was already historically horribly embarrassing for UCLA to be sued by the AAUP, but to have a second lawsuit for an infringement of academic freedom, and my position was I should have the freedom, as long as human subjects are protected, to do whatever research interests me. Isn't that what the university is supposed to be about?
Yeah.
Anyway, I finally, with that help, with the threat of AAUP sanction and the support of the departing department chairman, we got the Human Subject Protection Committee approved with a 3-page informed consent. And on that informed consent that our research subjects would have to sign, it warned them that the needle could break off inside their body. It might require surgery to remove it. It might cause permanent organ or nerve damage that they may not recover from. I mean, it was something that I wouldn't sign.
Horrible. And
But
untrue.
nevertheless, people heard about acupuncture and they were interested. And I would tell you that within, let's see, I guess we started in 72. I had that postdoc in psychiatry, then I switched to anesthesia in 73. So I think probably by 74 we were going. They wouldn't give us any space or any money. So I went back to the psychology department, where I'd been president of the graduate students and had been singularly influential in choosing the current chairman of the department. And made a deal with the department. I said to him, well, what if we can get you some discretionary money to support graduate students or other faculty that can't get grants or whatever? He said, well, how much? I said, a couple thousand a month. He said, well, you're talking about, he said, well, why? I said, well, the basement of building A is filled up with just storage stuff. We'd like to move all that storage stuff into a warehouse. The university's got a warehouse. We'd like to pay to have it moved. And we'd like to set up a clinic there in the basement of the psychology department where we can do acupuncture research. He said, I can't take rent. I don't own that space. It's owned by the regents of the university. How can I charge rent for it? I said, well, it's just going to be a departmental transfer. So we set it up. So that's what happened. So we got space. And this professor and I started seeing patients there and charging them for it and taking that money to pay the rent. And within a year, okay, maybe a year and a half, I had 50 people working in that clinic, including 5 physicians. I had an internist, I had a neurologist, I had an orthopedist, I had a psychiatrist, I had a family physician. Um, 4 of the services were sending residents through as part of their training, because we had expanded beyond acupuncture to bring in people that were doing biofeedback, who were doing Feldenkrais, who were doing Alexander technique, who were doing massage and manipulation technique. I mean, everything that we thought could help chronic pain. And of course, we had acupuncturists from China, from Korea, from Europe, and so forth. Anyway, I started going out.
What was the official name of the entity?
It was called the Acupuncture Research Project, the UCLA Acupuncture Research Project.
Did it later morph into a pain center?
Yeah.
That's how I heard about you. Yeah.
Well, what I realized was I was having a hard time selling acupuncture to the other members of the UCLA faculty. Okay. I mean, I'd given lectures and lots of lectures and so forth about it, but I realized that one of the main things that we were seeing in the clinic, and if you looked at our data, one of the things we were having the absolute phenomenal results with was treating chronic pain, neuritis, neuralgia, arthritis, you know, all the different kind of chronic pain syndromes, backs and necks and joints and things of that sort. Acupuncture we were just getting phenomenally good results. And I remember one of my professors telling me as part of my training, "Doctor, use that drug while it still works." And I thought, well, you know, okay, maybe it's just the beginning thing, just beginner's luck or whatever. But I realized I started talking to some of the medical students and some of the residents that were coming through our training program. And I said, "What kind of training have you gotten in pain?" And basically what they said was, "Well, we were told that if it hurts a little, give them like a salicylate, like aspirin, or give them Tylenol. If it hurts more than that, give them codeine. If it hurts more than that, give them a narcotic. But if that still doesn't help, send them to a psychiatrist." I said, "In all the years that you went through medical school, that's what they taught you about pain?" And I realized, wow, we better set up a pain clinic and better make that mandatory training. As that's where the 5th vital sign, you've heard about the 5th vital sign.
No.
Do you know about the 5th vital sign program?
No.
Oh, we launched this 5th vital sign program to make pain the 5th vital sign that every physician should use when evaluating patients, every health professional.
For our viewers,
Anyway,
what are the first 4?
I'm trying to give you a shortened version of how I got there, but basically I started lecturing about acupuncture. And in one of the lectures, I met a very interesting guy. His name was Carl Symington.
Oh, yes, Carl and Stephanie, yeah.
He was a resident at Travis Air Force Base at the time. And I heard that he was an oncology resident who was teaching his patients to imagine their white blood cells on horseback, going out looking for cancer cells and chopping them up and so forth. And I thought, damn, what if we could get those soldiers to go after pain? Okay. And so I called Carl, we made an appointment, we met, we became instant friends. And Carl and I talked a lot about imagery, and it wasn't, I don't think more than 3 or 4 months later, I was lecturing at a major conference, and there was another speaker there who was lecturing about imagery, and his name was Irving Oil.
Oh, yeah. I met
Irving
him back
Oil,
in 75.
Irving Oil was a physician practicing in Bolinas, California. And he was basically a disciple of Carl Jung. He knew that Carl Jung was a student of Freud, but disagreed with Freud about the characterization of the id. And what Jung wanted to know was, well, where's higher powers? Like, where's intuition? Where's creativity? Where's empathy? Where's compassion? Where's all the goodies? So he left Freud, and in his explorations, he bumped into alchemy. And as he studied alchemy, Jung felt that alchemy was really a system of psychological transformation. You couldn't talk about that at those days. You'd get burned at the stake as a witch. So they used chemistry as a metaphor. And when they're talking about converting lead into gold, It's all these heavy things that are dragging you down, making you depressed, and how you transform that into your shining golden light. So Irving got turned on to something that Jung wrote called the Mysterium Conjunctionis, a series of treatises. Okay. And he began coming up with modern versions of it. And one of the things that was talked about in the Mysterium blew my mind when I read it too. Jung talked about what he called the technique of active imagination, where you imagine a part of your psyche that is very wise and very loving. Okay. And we thought, wow, would that be helpful to patients? Because we knew about the inner critic in those days. Okay. But we thought, what about an antidote to the inner critic of a part of the psyche? So if it didn't sound so much like a jock strap, we would have called it the inner supporter. Okay. But we ended up with the inner advisor. And that just made an absolute left turn in my career. Okay. And people often wonder, why would I leave all the physiological research I was doing on pain? I was working with electronic stimulators of the brain and just doing a whole lot of, pretty advanced physiological research to focus my time on doing research with imagery. Why would, and the problem with imagery is people think if it's imagery, it's imaginary, it's not real. Okay.
Yeah.
Which couldn't be more wrong.
All in your head.
So they always ask me, why would you leave, all this scientific research to be doing research on imagery? I said, look, I don't have the faintest idea about how a computer chip works, but I sure work with a computer. And I'm telling you that the research that we did when I was in the psychiatry department, I was a fellow in the Brain Research Institute at UCLA. And I spent a lot of time doing some good research there. But one of the things that we learned was only about 10% of all the neurons in your brain have to do with language acquisition, interpretation, memory, and learning. Okay. 90% of all the busyness that's going on in the brain, if you look at the transmission across not just the corpus callosum, but the anterior and posterior commissures, the insula reticularis. I mean, if you look at the nature of that transmission, it's all imagery. An image is a thought form with sensory qualities. It's something you see, smell, taste, touch, feel, or hear. Okay. And that's the information that the brain uses. That's how it's talking to itself and to different parts of itself. It's giving basically sensory information from the senses to other parts of the brain. That's how it communicates. So I began to realize, well, guided imagery is not just about giving people better images to think about, because we knew of the relationships to images and emotions in physiology. It's really to understand the images that the brain is evoking and using that information in the service of healing. And we ended up calling it interactive guided imagery. We realized there's 3 levels of interactivity. One is listening to a tape, which is non-interactive, okay? And while that tape is giving you suggestions about a beautiful walk on the beach, you may be thinking about bills you have to pay or something else. So there's no interaction with the listener. There's then what we call one-way interactivity, which is listening to a tape with the pause button. And you will say, take a moment and allow yourself to get more comfortable and relaxed. And let me know when you're feeling more comfortable and relaxed. Pause. And what that does is it allows you to pace imagery appropriately with the client. Because if you go too fast and you say, think of a clear blue sky with white puffy clouds, and they're thinking in a green pasture, and they're thinking, and you're going on to what they're doing in the pasture, say, wait, I almost got the sky, and they get frustrated and you lose it. And you have other people who have just instant imagery, and you're saying, and the clouds are so soft, like little balls of cotton, gently. It's boring, okay? And their brain is going to go somewhere else. So you have to know how fast people pace, what their pace is, and what one-way imagery can do that, okay? But by far, the most powerful is interactive, because you can't write a script. You have no idea where it's going to go. You are just basically asking questions with adjectives and adverbs, and you're letting the client supply the noun. What we say is the guide provides the setting, but the client provides the jewel. Okay. So for example, I do a lot of work with patients who have experienced trauma. And one of the things we learn through EMDR and imagery and other things is if you can go back to the core trauma, the very first time they had that particular emotional experience and process it, okay, all the subsequent time. If you go back to the first time they were humiliated, the first time they weren't chosen, the first time that they got injured, the first time that something wasn't reciprocated, whatever it may be. And imagery can do that. It's a technique called the affect bridge. You simply say to somebody, close your eyes and let your mind wander back to the very first time that you felt this way. Okay. And it's just phenomenal. Do you have time for a quick story?
Yeah.
I've been wondering where to tell this. I've been even thinking about publishing. When I tell people this story, they say, you just have to publish this because it's such a good example of how early trauma affects us later in life. Okay. A few years ago, one of my kids got into trouble. And because I played football and martial arts and all that stuff, I never had much experience with fear as a kid. I was just fearless and always the first one to do stuff and so forth. But this scared me. And when I went to my own therapist, he said, look, I haven't seen you scared like this before. You know, maybe we should do some regression work with it. So I taught him how to do EMDR. I taught my own therapist how to do imagery work and so forth, because I wanted to get the benefit my patients were getting, right?
Yeah.
So I'm telling him about this thing with my kids, and he's saying, let your mind wander back to the first time you had this particular feeling of danger. And what pops into my mind out of the blue was a trauma I went through when I was 2.5, okay? I was the youngest of a bunch of kids, and I had a security blanket. It was a blue blanket with a blue satin trim, okay? And I was never without that blanket. They couldn't take it away from me. I'd wake up during the night when it was gone and so forth. But you can imagine after 2.5 years how many microorganisms were growing on that blanket. Baby blanket, okay? It must have smelled just horrible. And I had really loving parents. I mean, my father told me he loved me and my brother every day, hugged us and kissed us. I mean, I had no complaints, but they decided it's time for the blanket to go.
Oh, dear.
So I wake up, my blankie, my blanket. I remember this, if you can imagine. My blankie, and I hear my mother in the other room, I can't stand this. Let's give him the blanket. My father says, no, we have to just let it go. It'll be okay in a couple of days. And it was. After a couple of days, it was gone. And I know this was an early trauma, and I've talked to various people. I even talked to Abe Maslow about this because I just wanted his feedback on it. But I'd never done any EMDR or imagery regression with it, okay? So because I taught my client an abbreviated technique, he's moving my eyes back and forth, and he says to me, the right thing. He says, well, could you go to a baby store and buy a blue blanket like that with the blue satin trim? Could you do that this afternoon? And I laughed and I said, yeah, I could. He said, well, while you're there, could you buy like 5 blankets? So if one got lost or you couldn't find it or got ruined, you know, you always have an extra blanket. And I laughed. I said, yeah, I could. He said, well, if you could buy 5 blankets, could you buy 10 blankets and just store them away and never, ever have to worry about losing a blanket again? I laughed. I said, yeah, I could. He said, do you need to go to a baby store this afternoon and get those blankets? I said, no, I don't think so. But that afternoon, I'm driving with my wife of 30 plus years in the car at the time. And she turns to me and she says, oh my God, you must have done some imagery work and some EMDR. What did you do? She's a triple Scorpio. She wants to know everything. I'm a bit of an asshole. I don't let her get away with that stuff. And I said, well, what makes you think I did some imagery work? And so she said, I don't think so. I know you did. This is incredible. What came up for you? And I said, well, just how do you know that I did some imagery work? And we were on the freeway at the time. She said, well, you know, I'm not a good passenger, okay? And when we're on the freeway like this, one thing I appreciate is you always leave space between us and that car in front of us, because at those speeds, you never know what those jerks are going to do. But when a car comes up from the right or the left to get into that space, you always speed up. You never let anybody into that space. You're letting everybody into that space today, and I've never seen it in all the years I've been with you. I realized at that moment, okay, that space was like my blanket, okay? You think you're going to take my blanket? I don't think so. But after doing this technique, it was like, I'll just back up and make another blanket. As much as I know about imagery, I never would have associated my contemporary driving on the freeway with a trauma that happened when I was 2.5. Okay. But also being an ex-academician and wed to the scientific method, I tell people this all the time. Just because it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, doesn't mean it's a duck. There are things that can do that. But you know what? If it has baby ducks, probably a duck. So here's the story. None of my 6 kids have ever heard the story of my blanket. I never told any of them that. But they've all driven with me since. And every one of them is coming. Dad, did you take an adult driving class or senior driving class? Or you're driving so differently, Dad. And I realize it affects other things in my life. When somebody tries to take something that's of value to me away, I used to have that reaction. My house burned down, okay? The house I lived in for 30 years burned to the ground, okay? And I escaped with, as I said, my life and the clothes on my back and my cat. That was it. My wife and my cat, the 2 most precious things in the world to me. Anyway, I'm just grateful that I had 30 years to live in that place. That's how I feel about it. I just let it go. It's like, I don't have a problem with issues like that just from having done
In that
this
one
procedure.
session.
And it
Wow.
just, again, instills in me, and I do this with patients all day long. I mean, because of the pandemic, I'm not able to do acupuncture or a lot of sort of invasive techniques, but I'm still a licensed psychologist and I can still do EMDR and imagery work and psychotherapy. So I'm still in active practice. I still have quite a few patients that I'm helping and counseling with them like this on Zoom or on the phone and so on. It's good. It's a little different, but it's good.
Well, let's go back to the evolution of your pain clinic, because when I first got to California, actually the year before, when I met Marty Rossman and Irving and Mike Samuels, and I went over to Bolinas. And holistic was the buzzword. You spelled
Yep.
with an H or a W, and then I started hearing about you and the pain clinic. Like, besides holistic, you were this other. Everyone was referencing it. I hadn't had yet to meet you, but you were like a beacon of knowledge and or a new approach. So you were getting some, and there was a holistic clinic in the Chicago area that a physician, no, it was a minister was running it, or just a few things. Oh, and then Norm Shealy. You
Mm-hmm.
must have had some connection with Norm at that
Oh,
point.
yeah. Good friend.
Yeah. How did you interact, or did he get the idea of doing pain from you?
Well,
Or just,
I got interested in Norm with his early reports on electrical stimulation for pain because most of the techniques up to that point was taking stimulation away by doing invasive surgical procedures and so forth. And he was coming up with things like dorsal column stimulators and just transcranial stimulators, all kinds of electrical devices that he felt could control pain. So we started a communication. We ended up at one of the, we were all going to the annual pain meetings of the American Pain Society. And I think I had gotten an award. I got a Lifetime Achievement Award for the American Academy of Pain Management for the early research I did on pain. And I think Norm had also gotten a similar award earlier, and he was very excited for me about it. And we became really close friends after that. And I'm still stayed in touch. I still get emails from him from time to time about some of the wild things that he's doing.
oh
And
yeah.
I try to keep him informed of some of the things I'm doing too. So we're still out there, still clanging away.
Yeah. I interviewed him about a year ago, and he was going strong then. And then Gladys McGarry at 99
Oh yeah.
got her. Anyway, so how did it evolve? I know that you had a conference at a hotel near LAX. Must have been about 79, because I met you and Ken Pelletier was there. That's where he gave me the idea of going to Costa Rica, because I was freaked out at the US was bankrupt and was all going to come crashing down, and where was a safe island I could move to. And Ken says, Well, what about Costa Rica? They got 6 feet of topsoil, and that was what led us there for 5 years. But how did it evolve? You had this national meeting that there must have been a series of them, but that's the only one I came to. Uh,
As I began to see some of these techniques really being effective and helpful, okay, I thought it was important that we teach other doctors about it. So I began to teach courses through UCLA Extension. And within a couple of years, I was teaching more than half the courses in allied health sciences through UCLA Extension, as many as 3 or 4 courses a year. And we taught them on massage and manipulation and on biofeedback and on hypnosis, acupuncture, electrotherapy. I mean, all those kinds of things that we were doing in the clinic that had, you know, clinical efficacy, we wanted other people to know about. And then Ken and I became friends, again, had met at a conference and became immediate and instant friends and still are. And with the help of the coordinators of UCLA Extension, we decided to do a joint program, both with UC San Francisco, I think it was, and UCLA Extension. And Ken would represent UCLA San Francisco, and I would do UCLA. And we would do the course twice. We'd do one in LA and one in San Francisco. And I think it was based on his book, Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer.
mm-hmm.
And we also did a course. I had set up a correspondence with Norman Cousins, okay, following his publication of Laughter is the Best Medicine, and those publications. So he was going to be the keynoter of another program only for physicians, okay, called the Search for Health, okay. And a lot of the faculty would be in both conferences, okay, so we could get double use of the faculty. We had over 2,000 physicians sign up for that course, which is more than comes to UCLA graduation.
Wow.
And the dean was really pissed.
Why? Oh,
Yeah, we had, I think we had 1,700 people that came to the public program, and over 2,000 physicians came to the medical program for CE credit.
And where'd you squeeze them all in? Big hotel?
I think it was in Royce Hall.
Oh.
I think that no, maybe it was at a hotel. Maybe we were doing hotel conferences on the side because we were coordinating with an outside nonprofit that we had set up to help fund some of the research that we were doing. And it was a joint venture between the nonprofit and the extension programs. So I think it was at a hotel. Yeah.
The one I came to was a hotel just near LAX on.
Yeah, it was the grand ballroom of a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
They were great conferences. I mean, Carl Simonton spoke. I mean, we had phenomenal people coming to some of those conferences. I wish we still had the tapes from them. They're still probably good.
Yeah. So this would have been late 70s and into the early 80s.
Yeah, pretty much.
So then what was your next step with your career? And somewhere along the line, you probably got married again and had some kids.
Yeah, I got married and then had some kids. And by the time I had 6 kids, I had my older 4 kids gone through the routine school system. They've been in good private schools and so forth and so on. But I had, all right, I'll tell you the story. Okay, I don't think there's hardly any people that know this story.
The secret's out.
My wife had stumbled across a videotape of a guy who had done early education. His name was Glenn Doman. What had happened was, prior to the development of anti-seizure medicine, kids who developed epilepsy were dying of respiratory failure. And it was just horrific for the parents to watch their kids go into seizure and die. So drastic measures were taken. And one of the measures was a surgical technique where they removed half a hemisphere of the brain in these kids.
Wow.
And it stopped the seizures.
Yeah, and a lot else.
Yeah. So Doman, who was a psychiatrist and a learning specialist, wanted to know if these kids could still learn. So he formed a Rand Corporation group of experts, and they started to work with these kids to see if they could teach them. And they knew they had to do it a different way. And he came up with a radical educational system that's, I mean, if you're interested, I could tell you about it, but it's a whole different kind of way of learning. And as these kids grew up and developed, when they give them IQ tests, these kids with half a brain had higher IQs than normal kids. And Doman goes, what? How can that possibly be? Yet, what's going on with normal kids? You know, why are these kids doing better? And his hypothesis was that normal kids are getting just bored to death. You know, that their learning is very, very quick. He says babies come into the world as little geniuses, okay? You give them a toy, they pick it up in their hand, they put it in their mouth, they taste it, they smell it, they might listen to it, look at it, and so forth, and they drop it. And you think they're clumsy and uncoordinated. So you pick the toy up and put it back in the baby's hand. He goes, throws it away again. Why? He's got the toy. And you watch a baby when a new person walks in the room, like a computer scanner, just. He says these babies come into the world as little geniuses, and the school system is de-geniusing them. And he sets up a whole research program called the Institute for Advancement of Human Knowledge in Pennsylvania. We contact him and we get some of the resources, and he wrote a book called How to Teach Your Baby to Read. I read the book, it blew my mind. It just made so much sense. Babies don't have visual acuity. They can't see little letters, but you give them letters this big. So my wife starts to do all this stuff, okay? And like one of the notions is on a file card, you would write telephone and you'd put it by the telephone, okay? And you just leave it around for a day, all right? And then you say to the baby, crawl over, touch the telephone. And the baby ultimately knows how to touch the telephone. Then you remove the word from the telephone and you put around, touch the telephone, touch the word telephone. And I'll go over and touch the word telephone because it's the pattern recognition that they get. He says, when you teach kids rat, sat, fat, hat, it's boring. It all looks the same. But a word like spaghetti is an interesting word. If the G goes down, the two T's look like a hat. And if you have a bowl of spaghetti and you put that word down next to it, they never forget it, okay? It's never forgotten, okay? So we do all this stuff and we find out that our little baby kids that we started in at 6 months are learning at a phenomenal pace. And so we decided to have them tested, okay, because we're just parents, right? So we take them to this school for gifted children in Los Angeles. They have to have IQs over 150 to get into the school. It's a specialty school for gifted kids. And I figure, okay, these kids are reading and writing and, you know, they're 3 years old, one of them's 4, one of them's 2, and they're doing math. I mean, they're doing all this stuff. Maybe she should test them. She says, well, it'll be about 20 minutes to a half an hour. An hour and a half passes and they're not done. And this was with, I think my son got tested first. Comes out and she's kind of pale. And she says, I've never seen anything like it. He's 2 standard deviations above the limit of, I gave him the adult whisk waist test. He just blasted the juvenile testing. I had to give him adult testing. And we said, well, I'd like to have his sister tested too. She said, well, it's very unlikely. You never have 2 gifted children in the family. And I said, well, we'd still like to get her tested. She was 3. One? Yeah, she was 3 standard deviations above the mean. So when we come out, the president of the school is waiting for us. And it's a school, I guess, started in September. This is late November. And he's saying, you've got to admit, you're just parents. We are specialists. We know how to raise these kids. We know how to do it. So what do we know? I mean, it's a lot of money and it's a very expensive school and so forth, but these maybe are gifted kids. We want to give them every opportunity. We go, okay. We put the kids in the school. In January, the earthquake happens. And they tell us that if the earthquakes continue and get worse, we could be separated from the kids for a couple of weeks. That's child abuse. That's not going to happen. Yank the kids out of the school. Nobody could believe that you get your kids in that school and then you yank them out. And we decided to homeschool the kids, which we did for the next 8 or I think we put them back in the 8th grade, 7th or 8th grade. They went back into the school system, back to the same school. But in the 7th, I think she went in the 6th grade, he went in the 8th grade, just so they could have the social connection and so forth. I mean, they were getting, classes in art and dance lessons and sporting games, and they were having plenty of social activation. But it was the best time I've ever had in my life. Was homeschooling these kids. I did a lot of work at Harvard, and when I was in Boston, I'd bring the kids, and my wife would take them through all the historical monuments related to the Revolution. And I did work at NIH, and they would go through all the museums in Washington, while I was working for a week or two at a time. It was just a phenomenal period of time to take those kids around interesting places. And
how old are they
just to be
now,
able
and
to teach them.
what are they doing?
Yeah, well, one of them, he was pre-med, and he went to medical school at Tufts. And
My alma mater.
he was president of the Medical Students of America. And one of his professors at Tufts was president of the American Medical Association. So the two of them rewrote the medical curriculum for all medical students in America. Do I have to say anything more? Okay. So he graduates from, what happened was this, okay? He went to one of my lectures, okay? I, again, don't tell people this, but I'll tell you, all right? He went to one of my lectures, and I was frustrated, I guess, with what was going on in the medical school. And I said something like, I think it's easier to teach medicine to psychologists than to teach physicians how to talk to patients. And he remembered that, okay? And he found that there was a program at Boston Medical School where you get a master's degree in counseling psychology, and then you go to medical school.
At
So
BU.
he was, yeah, at BU. So he got into the program. He got his master's degree in 2 years, but he transferred to Tufts because there was a professor there that he wanted to work with, okay? So he graduates from Tufts, and he gets the #1 residency in the country, which is, of course, UCLA, because everybody wants to come to Southern California. And he finished his doctorate. He did a 4-year residency. So he's now a board certified psychiatrist in practice. He's not practicing in my office. He's got his own. I don't think that's healthy. He's got his own practice, and he's really, really successful. And my daughter is finishing her PhD as a child psychologist. She wants to work with kids. She's pregnant at the moment, so not going to happen for a little while.
Wow.
Anyway, I was homeschooling the kids and traveling all around, and I ended up going back to UCLA later, okay, as an associate professor, and just again teaching residents and medical students, teaching acupuncture.
Another little piece on your personal life is, how did you meet your wife, and early, social connect on the personal side? Where and when did you meet?
That's a magical story.
Oh, good. I like them.
It's a crazy story. Okay. I was married a second time on the rebound from the first divorce, and that one lasted 6 years with 3 kids. Okay. But it just wasn't going to work out. And then both of us knew it, and it was amicable, and we separated. And so being a doctor and single with kids makes me a great candidate for single women with kids. Okay. Mm-hmm. So everybody's trying to fix me up all the time because they know I'm child friendly and I'm a doctor. Okay. And I was just not interested anymore. I just was busy. I hadn't started homeschooling at that point. But I was just busy. I had the 3 kids at that time, and I was just busy taking care of them and so forth.
Full
And
time?
no, I was working at UCLA, and I had a private practice also. Okay.
But you were sharing custody, or you had full custody?
No, we were sharing custody of the kids. So she had them during the week. I had them on the weekends.
Hmm.
And anyway, one of my patients, who was a stunt woman who was injured in the Cannonball Run, um, told me she had a girlfriend, also a stunt woman, that she thought I might like, and she wanted to fix me up with her. I agreed to meet her, and so we agreed to meet at a bar in Malibu. And I would say within a minute or two, I realized she had the communication skills of your average tree, and that I wasn't particularly interested in. But she invited me to come back to her apartment in Malibu to meet her roommate. And I thought, okay, I'd like to check out apartments in Malibu, see what they're like. So I went back, and it was clear it was going to be a setup, okay, and I wasn't going to walk out of there intact, okay. And I just was not interested in that, okay. I'd been to Bryn Mawr, I'd had plenty of opportunity to be with women, trust me. And I was looking for a mother for my kids, and a mate for me. So I escaped that one. And so the stunt woman says, well, I'm sorry that didn't work out, but I've got another woman that's perfect for you. I said, no, thank you. She said, no. She's very spiritual, okay, and she's really creative, and she's got a kid, and I think you'd like her. I said, no, don't bother me. She calls her on the phone and hands me the telephone and says, here, you got to talk to her. I pick up the phone. I said, I'm really sorry to bother you, and she laughs, and she has the most incredible laugh. It's just the most natural. It's just authentic. It's an authentic laugh. And so I started laughing. We started talking, and I said to her, well, can I call you? I'm busy with patients. It's busy, but I'd like to talk to you tonight. Could you give me your number? She said, I don't know you. I don't give my number out to strange men. I said, well, if I give you my number, would you call me? No, I'm not calling you. I don't call men. That's not what I do. So I start working on her, and I'm pretty good. So I finally convinced her to give me the number. Okay. So I call her that night, and we start talking, and she starts telling me about her kid, and I start telling her about my kids, and we're just talking about kids and blah, 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 blah. And I yawn, and I look out, and I said, is that the sun coming up? What the hell time is it? It's 6 o'clock. Oh my God, I'm late. I gotta get. I said, look, it was been great talking to you, and I know we can't talk all night, but I'd love to call you again tonight. So yeah, okay, but we'll just talk real fast. That's fine. So the next night I call her, and we talk all night again. Okay. And so now I'm telling you, I'm sleeping on gurneys in the pain clinic. Okay. I'm catnapping during the day when I can. And so the third night, I think 3 nights we talk, most of the night. Okay. And she says to me, well, I can't talk to you tomorrow night. I said, well, how come? What's up? She said, well, it's my birthday, and I'm going out with a couple of my girlfriends for dinner. And I'm telling my secretary at this time, I said, I think I'm falling for this woman. I have no idea what she looks like or anything, but she's just fantastic. And I said, well, maybe I'll come wish you a happy birthday. Where are you going to have dinner? She says, well, we're having dinner at Gladstone's, which is a restaurant not far from the Palisades where I was living. I said, well, I'll come down to the Palisades and wish you a happy birthday. She'll say, well, how do you know how do you know who I am? There'll be a lot of people there. And Mr. Big Mouth here says, if your car drove by my house in the middle of the night, I'd know it was you. And she says, oh, now that's a good one. She says, well, I'll tell you what, you find me at Gladstone's on a Friday night, I'll come home with you. If you don't find me, don't ever call me again.
What a story.
I have asked her about this countless times. Okay. And she says, that's just exactly the way it would have been. Anyway, my secretary is real excited about this. Okay. So she wants to, and I figured it's better to not just be a single guy looking around for women, but I'll take my secretary with me. So we go to Gladstone's. It's a Friday night. The place is standing room only. Okay. And the clamor, I thought I could hear her voice and recognize her voice. The clamor was just, I mean, it must have been 100 decibels in that place. I mean, it was just, everybody was drunk and screaming and yelling. And I thought, oh my God, how am I ever going to find her in here? So we push our way through the crowd, and I figure, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. Okay, I'm here. Let's just kind of see if you get the vibe anywhere. And they had a real long bar, and at the end of the bar were these three women, and they were very attractive. And one of them had their back to me, and I don't know, I just got the vibe. Maybe it's that one. So I send my secretary out, walking all the way, working through the crowd, and she gets around to check out the three, and I told her, be sure to check that one out. She does, and she gives me the high sign. And I don't know, so I'm following her. Their table gets called, and I look at her, and she's really attractive, okay? And I thought, wow, I don't know if that's her or not. Anyway, she gets seated at the table, and they start to eat and so forth. And I find a waiter. I brought a rose, and I gave the waiter $10 in the rose. I said, take this rose to that woman right there, that make sure it's that one, and tell her it's from David, okay? So the waiter takes the rose over to her, and she stands up, okay, and immediately just starts looking around like crazy, okay? And I let her kind of look for a while, and she finally sits down, and I sneak up, and I come into the seat, and I sneak into the seat next to her, and I say, it's me. She turns around to look at me like, and it was really, really strange to like, I don't know that I had an image of her, but she was a model, okay? She was really attractive. And so she came home with me, and I don't think that we were apart. One night, she would travel with me when I do gigs and stuff. I don't think we were apart probably for the next year or two, and now we're going on, I think it will be 40 years next November. So it looks like it's a keeper.
I'd say so, yes.
But that's how we met, and it's a Jack Sprat relationship. Okay, she's the artist, and I'm the scientist, if you want to think of it that way. But we're just on the opposite ends of. It really taught me about compatibility. Compatibility is not about being the same. It's about being a fit, okay? It's about where I'm weak, she's strong, and where she's weak, I'm strong. That's compatibility, okay? So I don't particularly care how things look, okay, as long as they work, okay? I don't have much tolerance for things that don't work, but if they're a little ratty, okay,
yeah,
as long as they work, it's fine, okay? So my stapler, I've had the same stapler for 40 years, okay? I probably had the same Scotch tape dispenser for 40 years. They get beat up over time, okay? And my wife is always wanting to replace those things, okay? She doesn't care if they work or not, as long as they're pretty.
they look good. I got one like that.
Anyway.
I only met her 10 years ago. It took me a while to get to find her, but so, and I'm gathering that you then had two more kids together, and those are the two that we've been talking about.
Definitely his, hers, and ours.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we did the two kids together. And just raising those was the most fun I've ever had. No question about it. I was so busy with the four older ones with the pain clinic and starting the acupuncture program, and then starting the Imagery Academy, and just pretty busy with a lot of, work-related stuff. Just didn't have the extra time to spend. I spent a fair amount of time with them, and we played a lot of sports together and did a lot of activities together, but it wasn't a 24/7 contact with the kids like we did with the younger two.
Right.
They didn't go to school until they were in the 8th grade and 6th grade. Really?
My daughter till the 6th grade, so I'm familiar with that, and she was in a one-room schoolhouse her first year in school, and that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So now you've got the pain clinic has been running. How is it still in existence, or what was its history?
The last time I counted, I think there's 6 pain clinics at UCLA now. Each of the departments has set up their own pain clinic. So I think there's one in ortho, one in neuro, one in family medicine.
Were they all
one in physiatry.
yours? Did they clone then, or how did they come
No,
about?
there's an East-West Center for Chinese medicine that does the acupuncture, but they're not very well utilized. And it's it's more Western medicine acupuncture than traditional Chinese medicine.
Hmm.
So
And how long did it last in the basement of that building?
well, it lasted until I resigned, and then they moved it back to the 2 floors underground next to the morgue in the hospital.
Oh boy.
When they were planning to do that. That was another thing that contributed to my. All right, since we're telling stories, I'll tell you the story. All right.
Go for it.
I was getting increasingly frustrated because I thought that the university was the bastion of academic freedom. And as long as you protected the rights and welfare of human subjects, you could pretty much do whatever research you wanted. It's so political, and people are so petty and so jealous. And so a reporter did a big 4-page spread on my early research on acupuncture in Us magazine. Okay. And I thought it would popularize acupuncture, and I agreed to do it. And they had pictures of me treating patients and so forth. And so it just pissed off the senior faculty. I was the assistant professor at the time. And it just pissed off the senior faculty that an assistant professor gets a 4-page spread in Us. It's just so petty. And anyway, there were other problems that were coming up. I tried to refer patients to the other departments just to get them checked out before we got turned loose on them, just to make sure that we weren't missing something. Or, I mean, we had 5 physicians in our practice, but particularly OBGYN, we didn't have an OBGYN. And when women had pelvic pain and they had been diagnosed with fibroids or whatever it may be, I still wanted to get them checked out. And I sent one patient with pelvic pain to OBGYN, and they ended up doing a bilateral salpingo oophorectomy on her. This is a 26-year-old woman who wanted to have children. Okay.
Ooh.
And it didn't stop her pain. And she ended up coming back to the pain clinic after this. I was so infuriated that without even talking, I mean, I sent her for just an evaluation referral, okay? Not for treatment, but they have to teach residents how to do these techniques, okay? So they look for candidates wherever they can find them, and that's what's going on. And then the final straw occurred, okay, when we had a technique that we would use basically for women with pelvic pain. It was a pudendal block, basically, but it required a radiographic suite and a radiologist and an anesthesiologist. I mean, it was expensive, and it cost, I think, something like $1,700 in those days to do this technique. But we could block the pudendal nerve, okay, and stop their pain, give them like a little oasis of relief, particularly if we used a long-lasting anesthetic, okay. The chairman of the department calls us in and tells us, stop teaching the residents how to do this technique. We're not going to do it here anymore. I said, what? He said, yeah, we're only getting reimbursed $350 for a technique that's costing $1,750. Let's just stop doing it. I said, what? He said, why would we teach residents to do a technique they're not going to do? They're not going to spend all that time doing doing a technique and only get paid $300. I said, you're going to teach them how to do this to end women's pelvic pain. That's why. Yeah. I said, when the insurance companies start telling us professors what we can teach our students, I'm in the wrong place. I'm in the wrong place. And I just felt that so strongly at that time. And it was just the end of a whole bunch of episodes like that made me feel it's time for me to move on. So I tendered my resignation. I waited until I got tenure. And then 1 month later, I resigned.
Show them.
I think I was the youngest professor ever to get tenure in the medical. I was only 39 at the time.
Uh-huh.
But I wasn't going to stay there. There was other things I wanted to do. And I took a job working for the World Health Organization. It was just fantastic. It's based in Wiesbaden, but I worked out of the Copenhagen office a lot. And I got to take my kids with me, okay? And And they had pen pals in different countries and different languages that they learned how to speak and communicate with them. And it was just a fantastic time. It really was.
So what else, was that right after you left UCLA or?
Yeah, and then I started my own practice. And as I said, I had a very large practice in the beginning. Um, when I took the staff of the pain clinic, which was 55 people, and I think we reduced it to 37 people. And we moved into a 10,600 square foot facility in Santa Monica. It had an indoor track, a 3,000 square foot indoor track, and hot tubs. And I mean, just we could do every type of physical therapy, every type of alternative modality, and wean patients off of narcotics and so forth. And we had a very, very, I mean, we were seeing 120 patients a day. That's a busy practice, okay? And after a year in that practice, I realized we weren't making any money. We were spending as much money as we were making because our nut was so high, okay?
Mhm.
And I realized I mean, I was hoping to set up a model clinic that other doctors would emulate, but nobody's going to emulate a practice that's not making money, okay? And so I exercised a weasel clause that I put into the contract, which allowed me to weasel out of the contract of my lease, and just pay them a little extra money. And I did that, and I moved to a 1,700 square foot facility, from a 10,600 square foot facility to a 1,700 square foot facility, which we then remodeled and so forth. And we ran 2 shifts. We ran one shift from, I think it was 6 till 2, and the other one was from 1 till 9, I think it was. Okay. And they would overlap for an hour and talk about, what they'd done during that day and so forth and so on. But almost two completely separate staffs. We had 2 biofeedback therapists, 2 massage, we had a bunch of acupuncturists and so forth. But we continued at that same rate in that 1,700 square foot facility. We were seeing 80 to 90 patients a day. So it was pretty successful. And I was able to make some money, and as I said, buy a 3,600 square foot home and do that on 22 acres in Malibu, where I raised my kids. So it was.
And was it emulated? Did other people copy it?
Lots of people. I actually set up a business for a while called Dollar Tech. It was a company to teach hospitals how to set up pain clinics. And 6 hospitals in Southern California and 2 in Northern California hired us, and we helped them set up their pain clinics, teach the faculty and the hospital staff, and give them all the paperwork and the protocols necessary for insurance billing and just all the mechanics of running a pain clinic.
Yeah. Happen.
And but I think it's hard to find a pain clinic today that doesn't include acupuncture as one of its modalities. And I'm very happy about that, because a lot of people that were sort of pioneers in developing new strategies and techniques didn't live long enough to see the worm turn and see the benefits that accrued from it. But I'm happy to say, as a result of maybe our early publications and early research and just our persistence at making sure that we could get it going at a major university, okay, maybe added to the credibility of acupuncture, and it's now pretty well accepted.
Well, I encountered it with Hal Balin on his houseboat in Sausalito.
Oh, sure, I remember Hal.
And but he unfortunately died early. And then there was a woman who worked with him that all of our staff were going to. They kept raving about it. I was the last one to go. And what was her name? Peggy, I want to say. Lost track of her. And then I had encountered in Columbia, Maryland, American School of Acupuncture that was following an English, an old English guy. I don't know if you know that. It was a whole different school of acupuncture, but
yeah, I do know who you're talking about. Not Worrell. What was his name?
Yeah, Worrell sounds right. Oh no, I'm thinking Olga Worrell.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Olga Worrell too. Can I tell you the experience we had with Olga Worrell, Irving and I, and Marty?
How could I resist?
We were at a conference together and became friends, of course. And so we're up in her what do you call it, hotel room. I think Marty came later, so I think it was just Irving and me, and we're talking to her about so forth. She says, she gets quiet. She sits up and she says, "We're not alone." Excuse me. There's some people here who want me to talk for them to you. So she goes to Irving and she tells Irving about his father, and she describes him and gives him all kinds of. And Irving just tears up a little bit. And then she turns to me and she says, "It's your grandfather who wants to talk to you. He's a rabbi, and he wants you to know blah blah blah, and his name is blah 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 blah, Judah and Yehuda, and blah 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 blah." And she tells me all these things, stuff that I didn't know about family and relatives and things like that.
But
But
she
I
had his
remembered them.
name. She
Mhm.
had his name and
Oh yeah, Yehuda. And so I come back home and I talk to my mother about it because she was a great family historian. And she said, "Yeah, Judah, it was his name. He was your father's father, and his Hebrew name is Yehuda." And she describes this man, and she goes through her box and she brings out this picture of this guy. It's like Olga completely described.
wow. And for our viewers, since I barely remember Olga Worrell, I pulled that one out of my memory. Give a little background. I know she was noted, and I place her in Baltimore for some reason. But
She was,
tell
she
us
was,
more.
I mean, the 60s brought out a lot of psychics, but she was one that agreed to let serious researchers do serious research on her. And that research, I mean, this is where I became friends with Montague people, Stan Krippner and Montague Ullman. Do you know about, we were all doing research on Kurlan photography. And
Right.
I went with Stan to Prague, to a conference in Prague on alternative medicine. And we met with some of the Russians who were doing very advanced work on acupuncture at the time. Because remember, the Russians had détente with China in 56. So
Mhm.
they knew about acupuncture way before we did. Anyway, Olga allowed herself to be really scientifically tested on some of the things that, are pretty grueling scientific tests, decks of cards where you have to guess which kind of card it is before it's turned up and things of that sort. I mean, pretty well controlled and well evaluated. And she rang true. She was considered at the time one of the people that was truly gifted.
Mm.
And this was by pretty hardcore scientists, okay?
Yeah.
Engineers, people like that. When we went to Russia, when we went to Prague, we met with some advanced people from the Moscow Academy of Sciences. And one of the things that Stan Krippner and I and others there wanted to know about was Nina Kalagina, the woman who could do telekinesis, move objects at a distance, okay, just through willpower, just make
Mhm.
something move. And one of the guys at the table says, "Well, anybody can do that." We said, "No, no, 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 no." She says, "Yeah, you want to learn how to do it?" We went, "You're kidding." She said, "No, we'll teach you how to do it." Okay. So I have to admit, we were all drinking Russian vodka at the time. Okay. So that may have influenced our scientific acuity, but I still remember it pretty well. Okay. He gets a water glass. Okay. He fills it to the top with water. He takes a shot glass and he puts the shot glass into the water and puts a toothpick on top of the shot glass. And he calls it a water bearing. And he said, "Watch." He takes his hands, okay, and he puts his hands on either side of the glass. He says, "Which way do you want it to turn?" And I think Stan said clockwise. And the guy goes, and that damn toothpick and that thing starts to turn clockwise. Okay. And we're looking at the toothpick and we're looking at each other like, is this really? I mean, it's one of those things where you really don't believe your eyes. Okay. He says, "Now I'll make it go back the other way." And he goes, and it stops. And now it's going back the other way. He says, "Now you try it." And all of us were able to move. I mean, not like he could, but we could move that toothpick a little bit. Okay.
Mm.
And when I came home back to Los Angeles, I mean, it was one of the things I just had to try. So I got a shot glass and a water glass and filled it up. And I'd say for maybe a couple of days, I seemed to be able to maybe move it a little bit, but after that, no more.
So
And
it faded.
I, I,
Interesting.
I've talked to Stan about it a couple of times over the years because it just so blew our minds. But he
Wow.
said that's the nature of psi phenomena. You know, it's sometimes you'll experience it, but it's difficult to get it to repeat.
Yeah, intentionality. Yeah.
Hmm.
For some reason, the name Jose Silva just came up too, as the intuitive stuff that he would do at the end of the Silva mind control, which
Mm-hmm.
I got exposed to, and then Werner copied it in the S training, and um, mind body was, we didn't have that word at that point. Then it became PNI, and now it's commonplace. But were you one of the instigators of that terminology, or uh, what's your
I'll tell you the story because it's an interesting story too. I really wanted to get Norman Cousins out to UCLA because I just thought he'd be a good influence to have on our team. Okay. And I had been lecturing at the Laughter and Play conferences about how you can help people in pain develop a sense of humor and find ways to make them laugh and lighten up the load a little bit. Okay. How vitally important laughter and play is in caring for people in pain. Anyway, Norman did come out to UCLA and we started talking about the type of research that we wanted to do. And he asked, well, what are your concerns and what kind of project would you want to do? And I told him of a couple of things and he picked one. And it was this one. Okay. Why is it that when people have a heart attack and the paramedics are called, usually when they arrive on the scene, the patient's still alive and they start an IV and they hook up an EKG and they have a link to the hospital and they transport the patient to the hospital, but 50% of them are dead on arrival. Why are we losing patients on the way to the hospital? And the hypothesis was they get stressed to death.
Yeah.
So we came up with a relatively unconventional research project, and I wanted to go to the Human Subject Protection Committee, but I realized that it would take way too long after my prior experiences with them. Because I'd done a lot of other studies that I'd had to get their approval for too. They knew me and they weren't happy with me. So we just did a pilot study on our own, but we could never publish it because it wasn't official. Half of the paramedics, okay, we told them the following. One of you is going to attend to the patient while the rest of you are attending to the patient's illness or problem, whatever it may be. When the patient starts to regain consciousness after a heart attack, take your gloves off and make skin-to-skin contact. You can usually get them by the neck. Just put your hand and hold them by the back of the neck and kind of massage them a little bit. And just talk to them in a very comforting voice and lie. Tell them, hi, pal, how you doing? Looks like you had a little slip or trip. I don't know what's happened here. And your tracing looks good. You look fine. But, my boss would really chew me out if I didn't take you back to the hospital and just kind of examine you, make sure everything's okay. How you doing? Okay. And just talk to them like that. Kind of gradually help them get into the ambulance. Turn the siren off. You don't need to. It's bad enough you're going to the emergency room, but turn the siren off. Have a nice leisurely drive. These patients already been stabilized by that time. Of the 50% of the paramedics that we taught to do that to, not one of the patients that they rescued from a heart attack came back dead on arrival. Not a single one.
Wow. What's the end of that experiment?
Well, again, I sort of realized early in my career that my purpose on this planet is to teach. It's what I love to do. It's what I'm good at, and it's what I think is important. So I started teaching paramedics. Okay. I'll tell you another funny story, real fast one though.
Well, my question was how many at the end, the number of people in the two different groups.
I'd have to look it up. I think
Like
it was,
roughly, like a dozen or 100 or?
oh, no, no, it wasn't 100, I think, because we wanted to know right away. I mean, we're telling them
Yeah.
to lie to patients, okay? It's not such a, I mean, they could be looking at the tracing and just see horrible things, but still
Yeah.
tell the patient that they're fine. We wanted to make sure that it was worth it, okay, in terms of risk benefit ratio before we went to the human subject committee with it. So I think we were looking at the first 24 patients, something like that.
No, significant. Yeah.
Yeah, it was enough to convince us that it, I mean,
Yeah.
none of them came back in from that group. And again, about 50% of the patients in the group that were taught to do that came back DOA.
Wow. So now your other story, I just wanted to catch details on that one. Do you remember it?
When HIV came upon the scene, I realized how serious it could end up being. And I realized I didn't know if I could make any contribution at all, but I thought, let's take a look at it. So I started doing some research. And I found a couple of things that were really, really interesting to me. There was a research team from the University of Nebraska that had done research in Zimbabwe. And they'd done research on 151 children. A third of them had HIV, a third of them had malaria, and a third of them had both. And the prediction was, since they were already immunocompromised from the malaria, the kids that had both would succumb the fastest. But what they found was none of the children, the kids in the malaria group were treated, okay? The kids in the HIV group perished, as according to the statistics that they would expect, but none of the kids in the both group perished. And that was really surprising, okay? There was another study that was done in Libya by another research team from the University of Massachusetts that found that when people had HIV and developed malaria, and they lived in the city and got the malaria treated quickly, they succumbed to the HIV. But when they lived in the sticks and they had to sweat out the malaria, you get a fever every other day. When they had at least 14 fevers, it's 28 days until they overcame the malaria, they no longer tested positive for HIV. So in further research, I discovered that a physician by the name of Walter Jurek had won the Nobel Prize in 1918 for developing a type of therapy that was called, what did he originally call it? I think it was originally called malariotherapy. And he used it as a treatment for syphilis, neurosyphilis. Because, HIV, they think, is a spirochete like syphilis. And in tertiary syphilis, 50,000 American doctors were getting doses of malaria, okay, to give to patients with syphilis, with neurosyphilis. And they found a curative, and he won the Nobel Prize for that in 1918.
Wow.
And it continued to be a treatment for neurosyphilis until antibiotics came on the scene in the 20th century, mid 20th century. And then, of course, it was stopped when penicillin and other things turned out to be a lot easier, didn't have to go through the sweats, okay? But it was still important to us. So Hank and I as it turned out, I found out that one of the other people that was looking at the same sources that I was through Science Citations, you can find that out, was Hank Heimlich. So I wrote him and I said, you've been looking at the same citations I have, and are you feeling like, based on Walter Jurek's work, that giving HIV patients malaria might be a curative in a similar way? And he thought, it's exactly what I've been thinking and wanting to do. So we became friends, okay? And he said, but I need to raise some money to do that research. I said, well, I can help you with that. So one of the people that I knew at that time was, let's just say, the wife of a very famous television personality. Okay, I have to be careful about disclosing my patients. Okay, but very, very hugely successful for 20 plus years on TV. And she agreed to get some of her friends together with AMFAR, the AIDS group here in Los Angeles. And so Hank flew out from the East Coast, and we went to her home, And in one night, we raised $380,000. These were people that could write $50,000 checks.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
thought, oh my God, all the time I spent writing NIH grant proposals and then writing justification of the budgets and progress reports and so on. And in one night, I raised $350,000 for research.
A
So
technical thing
so
is
we
that.
couldn't find any place in the United States that was willing to do this research. They weren't willing to give patients with HIV malaria. Okay, even though we showed them all the data that we thought would be helpful. But we found a team of American doctors who were practicing in Mexico
Mm.
and were very interested in it. And we thought, okay, well, they're Western trained, they know how to do this. And, we'll just give them malaria for 28 days and then treat them and then see to what extent they still have problems with HIV. Well, we had gone to the CDC and the FDA and so forth and so on. And even though it was Hank Heimlich, a guy who's got his name in the dictionary, I mean, how many people can say that? They still weren't going to let us do this research. So they sabotaged the work in China. And Hank ultimately found a research team. Sorry, they sabotaged the research program in Mexico that we were going to do. And Hank finally found a team in China where he was basically considered a hero. I don't know if you know this, but one of his other inventions was called the Heimlich valve. And what happened was soldiers, when they would have gunshot wounds to the chest, the lungs would fill with blood and they would suffocate. Okay. And you couldn't get the blood out of the lungs. And so what he did was he took a whoopee cushion, whoopee cushion, you put it on, you sit on it, and it makes that noise. He took the valve from a whoopee cushion and implanted it in the lung of a person whose lungs were full of blood. And every time they would breathe, it would pump the blood out and then it would close so they could inhale and get a fresh breath. Okay. And he saved something like, I don't know, 15,000 Chinese during the Second World War with this valve. And he was considered a national hero in China. So they actually did the research and found it really, really helpful. And I think they were doing it until the protease inhibitors and some of the other things came onto the scene. So
Now,
Hank actually left the study for another reason, which I think was really concerning. Okay. Hank had found, okay, Hank believed that a lot of people that had nearly drowned, that when you gave them CPR, it wasn't working because they still had water in their lungs. And he believed it was important to do the Heimlich maneuver to express the water out of the lungs first before you start CPR. So I helped him and we did a research study, okay? For the lifeguards in Seattle, we taught them how to do the Heimlich maneuver when they pulled a kid out of the pool that was drowning, okay, before they started CPR. And for the lifeguards in Tacoma, which was a city just south of Seattle, okay, we just gave them information about drowning victims and doing CPR. I never told them to do the Heimlich maneuver, okay? At the end of the first summer, not a single child was lost in Seattle, and the usual number, I think it was 15 kids were lost in Tacoma. So he writes the Red Cross and he shows them the data and he said, please add to your protocol the need to do the Heimlich maneuver before they start CPR. Because the Red Cross had invested so much money in all their training materials and their programs and their teachers, they refused to do it. And Hank says, you're letting people die who don't have to die if they just do the maneuver before they start CPR. And they said, so they came up with some data from a publication of the National Academy of Sciences that said that drowning victims don't have water in their lungs. They die from a heart attack of not being able to breathe. Well, I was a lifeguard and I pulled you up out of the water and every damn one of them had water in their lungs when we started, okay? They all have water in their lungs. It's bullshit. But it just, Hank was so pissed about it. He just went to Congress. He was trying to get congressional support to have hearings done about it because he thinks way too many people are not being taught the right thing to do for
Mhm.
drowning victims. And I think he just shifted gears to focus on that. And I kind of lost touch with him at that point.
And but did that ever happen? I know they've stopped the mouth-to-mouth breathing now with the protocol.
Yeah. I
But
think that was probably 7 or 8 years ago.
in terms of drowning, though, I wonder if that has gotten into the protocol. Okay. One technical question is, I think that HIV is a retrovirus, not a spirochete.
Is it
Spirochetes are Lyme disease,
at that
but
time we thought it might be a spirochete. And
but fevers have a therapeutic value anyway, and you know it's stupid to lower fevers in kids that it's their body trying to clean it up.
that's right. That's
One more
Chinese medicine.
idiotic thing.
A fever is a body way it's trying to burn out some invading microorganism.
Yeah, exactly. So a couple other cross connections here. You mentioned biofeedback. Do you have any connection with George Spohr up in San Francisco? And
Just followed this research,
uh-huh.
and we had a couple of biofeedback practitioners and all the equipment in our clinic. We would use it sometimes to do some research with the imagery work, just to get some physiological measures while we're doing guided imagery work. But there's an organization used to be called the Wild Divine that had an automated biofeedback
Oh, I had
program.
one of those. Yeah, I had the Wild Divine. Still have it.
Because I'm such a great advocate of self-management, maybe I'll tell you my 3 wishes, okay? There's 3 things I want from a doctor when I go to see a doctor, and this is the way I try to treat my own patients. The first thing that I want is for that doctor to give me a diagnosis and tell me what's wrong, okay? I don't want people to say, well, let's just throw some things up against the wall and see what sticks. No, not for me. I want a real diagnosis. I'll take the time to figure out what's really underlying this imbalance, whatever it may be. The second thing I want to know is what are my alternatives and what's the likely prognosis with each one? And the first alternative is to thank me for my time and to walk out the door and do nothing. Okay, that's one alternative. But what's the prognosis? What I think will happen if you do nothing? And then I'll say, if you have surgery, this is what's likely. If you have acupuncture, and just give them the menu. And then the third thing I tell them is what usually I most want to know, which is knowing what you know. If you were me, what would you do and why? That's what I want from my doctors. And fortunately, it's one of the things that keeps me in LA, because it turns out there are good doctors here in LA. They're few, but they are here. There are some really good doctors here in LA.
Oh. Trying to piece together the chronology here. You've downsized your private clinic. You're making money on it. And when I visited you, 10 years ago or so, that was more like a separate office, I believe.
Yeah, that was my private practice at that time.
But the 1,700 square foot clinic, that was it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I only remember the office itself. And you're still running that?
No, because of the pandemic, okay, I've closed my office and I've stopped my acupuncture practice. I'm 77 years old. I'm in great health, but I'm just too old to be physically examining patients and treating all their pain problems. So I've pretty much had to stop acupuncture. But I'm continuing to do psychotherapy because I'm still a licensed psychologist, and doing Zoom sessions. You can do EMDR on Zoom. And
oh, really? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm just taking care of a lot of trauma now. It seems more than pain, even my specialty seems to be focused more on rapid trauma relief, just helping people overcome trauma.
One of the people on my list is the woman, I can't remember her name, that developed the EMDR. Do you know her?
Francine Shapiro.
Yeah, is she around? Could I interview her, do you think?
No, she passed away last year.
Oh, well.
What happened was, I heard about EMDR from Marty Rossman. He said there's this woman that's having people move their eyes back and forth to overcome trauma. He said, it's all I can do to deal with the imagery stuff. That's way over the top for me. I mean, I can't do it. But see, I had just spent 3 years in the brain research, a couple of years in the Brain Research Institute, okay? And I knew that we had two brains. I knew that we had a knowing brain, okay, that knows everything that we know and that's right up to the moment, but that we also have a feeling brain that's the limbic system, okay? And it's historic, okay? Let me just tell you very quickly my current work, okay?
Yeah. Hang on a
Do you
second.
need
They're
to
not
get
supposed
that?
to call me here. It's probably the hotel doctor. I'm going to pause the recording. Recording again.
I had
Okay, we're resuming the recording.
I really had a misunderstanding of trauma, even though I was seeing a lot of it in the pain clinic. My current definition of trauma is any life experience that exceeds your ability to cope.
Ah, really?
I have patients who are traumatized when someone looks at them the wrong way.
Uh-huh.
Okay, they're in the entertainment business, so it's understandable, but trauma is a very personal thing, okay?
Yeah.
If you have a life experience that exceeds your ability to cope, you are subjected to trauma. And here's some things that I didn't know, but I've now discovered, okay? Like every animal on the planet, we respond to trauma in one of four ways: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. Those are the four choices. And each one of those have long-term consequences emotionally. Even if you win, you know that there's a battle and you could be attacked again. If you lose, it's like submit. And freeze is what animals do, okay? They physically freeze. We only freeze for a moment, but we freeze emotionally, okay? We get stuck, okay? And what PTSD is a revivification of where we got stuck. Now, why this is related to imagery is that images are sponges of emotion. And someone who's been traumatized can be driving in their car and they can see a billboard that has an image on it. And that image evokes an image that was associated with their trauma. And they have an emotional reaction just from passing that billboard. You see, when I was taking care of first responders, I would find that it was the sensory modality that really held their trauma. There were people that would see something that would set them up for constantly being hypervigilant. There were people that answered the telephone and were told somebody died and they got shocking traumatic news on the phone. So every time the phone rings, they have an emotional experience. There were firefighters that could smell burning flesh and it just freaked them out. So anytime they feel food cooking a certain kind of way, it gives them a traumatic experience. Remember, an image is a thought form with sensory qualities. It's something we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, or feel. And these images are sponges. What a lot of people don't realize is that images can evoke emotions and emotions can evoke images because they're really on the same page, okay? So I began to realize, okay, that we have to unstick people. We have to process it. And let me give you an example of what processing feels like in your own life, Jack, okay? I want you to go back to high school or college, to the beginning of a romantic relationship. And there was someone who was interested in you, and there was someone you were interested in, and it was starting to get hot. It was getting really, really interesting. It looked like somebody really wanted to be with you, and you really wanted to be with that person. If another guy had stolen her away from you at that time, would have upset you back then? Is it likely that she's with another guy now? Does that upset you now?
No.
Why not? It would have been devastating back then. Why can you think of that and it's kind of boring?
Interesting.
What happened was you were starting to get attached to this person, right? And for some reason it didn't work out, okay? And you detached and you went through your grief and your anger or your sorrow, whatever it may be, and you attached to another person. You're not stuck in that relationship, okay?
What
you
if
processed
I didn't?
it. You
What if I
processed it.
didn't process it though? Because I'm a slow processor.
Here's how you find out, okay?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the body doesn't lie. And one of the techniques that I use, being wed to the scientific method, which says you can't reliably change anything you can't measure, the way that I measure it is using what Francine Shapiro calls a SUD scale, which stands for Subjective Units of Discomfort Scale. So I'll ask you on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is neutral and no discomfort, and 10 is the greatest discomfort you can imagine, how uncomfortable is it for you to think back on X?
Mm.
If it has a 1, that's nothing. It's like a new pair of shoes. You know, you break it in after a while, it's no big deal. But if it's a 5 or 6 or higher, it's still not processed. It's still setting up PTSD symptoms in you. It's the simplest way to find out.
This is fascinating because one of my passions has been attachment theory and the different types of attachment. I'm an insecure anxious, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
with an insecure avoidant, which is
Mm-hmm.
often the case. Is what's in a gay Hendricks calls them the glommers and the splitters, and we tend to respond to each other. I'm a glommer, she's a splitter, and the ridiculous statistics that 55% of Americans are securely attached. In our group, we think it's a single-digit number. And yet this illusion continues. So I notice, and it took me a long time, it's only a few years ago, I noticed if I'm in a conversation at someone's house or, people I don't usually see, and one of the people gets up and leaves, I have an abandonment anxiety until they come back. It's subtle, but it triggers my insecure anxiety stuff, which I never thought of as PTSD.
It may go back to an early childhood experience
Oh
that you
yeah,
didn't even think was related, just like my blanket
yeah.
affected my driving on the freeway. Okay, I never would have made that connection or made that association.
Well,
But thanks to imagery and EMDR, it fixed it.
for me, it was the 2 weeks I spent in the hospital nursery on a
Ugh.
4-hour bottle feeding schedule. And when I decided to check out and to go into a world in my head, I mean, that's pretty much my wound is my gift of why I've been interested in attachment and connection and lived in 6 different intentional communities and, you know, on and on, trying to recreate that connection that I lost with my mother. And I think most of our psychological and physical illnesses have to do with early trauma. And it was what's his name, Michel Odin says that the prenatal experience that we have has more bearing on our later health than any other factors. And we generally ignore it like it's just a lump, that we until even the misguided term, the first weeks of life. Hello, they're 9 months old when they come out, and a lot's been going on in there.
You
They
bet.
can hear you at 16 weeks, and they're picking up all their mother's emotional stuff and the vibes. It's like, so this is a huge area of study that our Alliance for Transforming the Lives of Children is focused on. We created a blueprint of what are the ideal conditions for birthing or gestating, birthing, and raising children. None of us had experienced most of these uh, conditions, but we figured out 100 different conditions and wrote them all down. It took 10,000 hours to create the blueprint and document as much as we could.
Wow.
But, and I don't know if you know Ray Castellino in Santa Barbara, a dear friend. I was describing my early morning 4 a.m. kind of feelings of something's wrong, waking up and, oh, there's this feeling of dread. And he says, you're just having an early infant memory and that disconnection. And it's so, yeah, it's definitely a form of PTSD, I think. And
I don't know why you're getting me to tell you all my secrets. Okay, but I got one more for you. Okay.
good, good.
Do you know who Art Janoff was? Primal
Oh yeah,
Therapy.
primal therapy. Yeah.
I worked with Art for a while.
Ah.
And in his facility here in Los Angeles, he built an artificial vagina
Uh-huh.
for patients. And it was this device that you climb into. You get naked and you put Vaseline oil all over your body. Okay.
Oh.
and then you climb into this device, okay? It's got hydraulic things on it that he controls. And so
Oh, wow.
it's squeezing you and pushing you and so forth. And he invites me to watch this guy go through this process. And he's struggling, he's fighting his way to get out of this artificial vagina, okay? And he's crying like a baby, okay? It sounds almost like a baby, like that, okay? The guy comes out of that, and the two things that I wouldn't even want to tell people about it because nobody'd believe it. But again, it's one of those lionized experiences, okay? On his butt, okay, was a clear palm print that big.
From the surgeon. Yeah.
And he had a positive Babinski.
Wow. Now, for our viewers, the Babinski is a neurologic response. So you scrape the bottom of the foot. But doesn't that usually mean brain damage? Or is it just an early, before you?
It's an early sign in a baby.
Right.
But and then they see it in adults.
Once their nervous system develops and myelinates, yeah.
But
Far out. Well,
he was probably in his late 30s.
It sounds like David Chamberlain's Babies Remember Birth, and people describing the obstetrician's tie and what was said in the delivery room, and he was experiencing it physically.
There's a literature on this, that if you look at people that have chronic upper respiratory problems and didn't correlate it, if they had the umbilical cord tied around their neck when they were being delivered and they had respiratory distress in the beginning, or what was the other one? There's a GI one that they've done too, where they find people that have Crohn's or IBS. There's something else that happens in early infancy that could set the stage for it.
That's my sister. I'd like to know about that one. Yeah.
You might be able to Google it.
Ray Castellino could often spot C-section babies across the room by their manners.
Wow.
And they didn't have to fight their way out, so they're often more passive and expect things to be done for them and struggle with taking initiative. So,
well, I'm sure all the early education stuff that we did with our kids really, they never sweated academics ever, okay, and all the schooling that they've had, so they were able to focus and concentrate on social interactions. What I like about it is they're raising their own children the same way. Our grandkids are they start teaching them when they're 3 or 4 months old.
Great. I'd heard about signing, not till it was too late with my daughter, and also elimination training, so you don't have to do diapers. That mothers in so-called primitive cultures know when they're going to pee and poop and just hold them over a bush, but we don't have that.
The babies, they don't have a lot of visual acuity, okay, and they don't have life experience, but they are geniuses, okay. I absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And just we unfortunately systematically de-genius them by restricting their experiences. So let them go.
I always remember when I was in med school, I'd go to the Unitarian Church to get a little hit of intellectual stimulation because it wasn't happening at Tufts. And at the Arlington Unitarian Church across from the public garden was John Holt speaking one day on the famous homeschooling guy why Johnny can't read. And he said that, when a kid's ready, they can learn in 2 weeks. And that encouraged me to then homeschool our daughter about 40 some years later. But there's a whole lot of wisdom. I want to wrap up with the history of your professional life, and then I want to ask you some other questions. But are there any other pieces of your professional development? You've moved through the center, and now you've closed the center, and you're working from your home. And any other big events professionally that we should record historically?
The two things that occupy most of my time now is my practice, my psychological practice, and most of that is taking care of people that have been traumatized with EMDR and imagery work. But my other love is the Academy for Guided Imagery. just teaching people how to use the power of their imagination to enhance healing. And we're still training doctors how to teach their patients how to do that. And this is now the 25th year of the academy, something like that. So I'm still teaching courses for the academy.
I'll put a link to the academy website in the description. So
oh, good.
We'll have that as well as anything else that we want them to see. And you just reminded me when you were talking about imagery, and I love that it's more than just visual. Most of us think of image as visual, but what's really been important to me was running into James Prescott in 1996 at an APA conference, who developed the whole concept of what he called SSAD, somatosensory affectional deprivation syndrome, from not being carried. Babies they've been moved in the womb all this time, and suddenly they're in a lifeless plastic carrier. And the importance of movement, which is really the first sense, and it was completely discounted. We talk about the five senses. Well, the first one is movement, the vestibular system. And I'm wondering, have you related that sense to imagery? Do people have PTSD, maybe vertigo or fear of heights, or is that a form of PTSD that's affecting their vestibular system?
Very, very interesting. I want to think about that a little bit.
Okay, well,
I'll let you know if I come up with something, but
okay.
Keep in mind how complex balance is.
Yeah.
Because it not only has to do with the vestibular system and our visual apparatus, it has to do with the bottoms of our feet, okay?
Yeah.
And people that develop peripheral neuropathy have problems with balance too. There's so many things that can affect balance, okay?
Well, it's the sense of movement, which would be an integration of all of those, of orientation in space. There's a term for it. I can't think of the medical term, but yeah. And what Prescott discovered was that babies who were carried and moved, and he studied 49 so-called primitive tribes, some of 24 of which were violent and 25 were not, or close to similar numbers. And he found 80% correlation with the nonviolent cultures carried their babies. And the other 20% that didn't correlate with that was another single factor, which was, as teenagers, the kids were able to have physical contact with each other, and they made up for the lacking in their early experience, because we rerun our whole development starting as teenagers, adolescents, that they were, and Margaret Mead wrote a book called Adolescent Sterility, where she observed these teenagers fumbling around with each other, but they didn't get pregnant, probably because they weren't having intercourse, but they were getting their needs for touch and movement met, making up for that. But those two single factors he found was 100% correlated with nonviolent cultures. I've interviewed him. He's still going in his 80s, and he was at NIH and running the child health and development section, and got fired eventually because he was saying mothers should be at home with their babies during the early stages of feminism, and in the 70s. It wasn't a very popular choice. Poor guy.
This makes total sense. I'll give you some of my Brain Research Institute information. The proliferation of nerve cells continues until about age 6. Pretty much by age 6, you have the number of brain cells you're going to have for the rest of your life. But during those first 6 years, I think things like movement and visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, all those things develop how many and how densely those nerve cells develop. So it makes all the sense in the world to me to develop, kinesthesis and proprioception to be. I mean, we did that with our kids. We would always carry them. They were always carried. They weren't we would put them in things that they could bounce up and down in, and little strollers that they could run around and walk in and stuff. We'd always keep them moving. And of course, with having 4 older brothers and sisters, they would always have rough and tumble play with the
Yeah.
babies. So they were stimulated like crazy, because that's what we believed. I mean, there was research that was done on sensory deprivation and sensory stimulation in animals, showing the number of brain cells were differentiated by the two. So I just wanted to make sure my kids had as many brain cells as we could help them get.
Well, now with all the focus on neuroplasticity, and I thought the belief was that we do grow new brain cells, or is it just that we create new synapses?
Yeah, that's more likely.
Uh-huh.
You know, Ross 80, who was one of the neuroanatomists at UCLA, did some really pioneering research and tracing some of these tracks down, and basically feels it's reconnection, not growth of new cells.
Well, it's certainly an encouraging development that the old view pretty much can't teach an old dog new tricks, but you can now. So people are doing it as your work is.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, let's wrap up your history, and if you have any parting words for future generations that will stumble across this in some vault somewhere, maybe, who knows?
I'll tell you one of the things that I'm wrestling with right now.
Yeah.
Very popular is the concept of evidence-based medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And as a former academician and a great advocate of the scientific method, I understand that. But at the same time, there may be a tendency to suppress innovation with it, okay? Because sometimes you have to try some things out. I mean, you really don't know how it's going to work, and you don't have the resources or the time or the ability to do a fully double-blind placebo-controlled counterbalanced study to prove efficacy, okay? And I'm afraid that a lot of pilot research that could really be very innovative and creative is going to get suppressed because people don't have resources to take it to the point where it could become evidence-based. Evidence-based is later, okay? I just think that we need to have some incentive to try really wild and crazy alternatives that may hold some promise for being beneficial without having to prove its efficacy in the beginning.
And the last I heard, and it was some years ago, that only 25% of medical procedures were evidence-based. So, hello.
Well, my favorite one is the PDR. Do you know how many? PDR contains some 10,000 medicines. Do you know how many have ever been shown to be more effective than placebo? Less than 10%.
Wow.
And here's how you can tell. Possibly effective in the treatment of bronchial asthma. Never been shown to be more. Doesn't mean that it's bad. I mean, it's just that the placebo effect is so damn powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, any more parting words? I want to wrap up this recording, and then I want to do another separate one about the current situation, your thoughts on that. So,
okay.
Any final
this
wisdom?
Has been good. You brought a lot of things I haven't thought about in a long time, and experiences that.
Delightful. This is fun.
Really.
Yeah. So you've been an inspiration for me for 40 some years, almost 50 years from when I opened the center and heard about you. That was 45 years ago, this month actually. So I will end this part of the recording.